Let me introduce, first of all, John Smollen. John is a partner at Nsan, and he's speaking here today on behalf of the National Council for Public-Private Partnerships, of which he serves on their board of directors. If you don't mind, I'll introduce you each in turn prior to your beginning of your statements. John, I've gotten to know recently. We have had some experience at my firm, Burns & Levinson, with him over the years. Firm Nsan does a good deal of work, not only regionally but throughout the country with respect to representation of communities and sometimes private participants in public-private partnerships. He's very knowledgeable. I've heard his presentation previously. I think it'll be of interest to you. Again, our goal today is to learn as much broadly as we can about public-private partnerships so we understand how they do and can work based on the experience of these individuals and in other states and jurisdictions. So without further ado, John, I'll let you take it away.
Thank you, Mr. Coffey. Thank you, members of the Commission, for taking the time to hear from us here today about P3s and more generally about how to think about innovative delivery. I have the distinct honor of sitting with some extremely notorious and well-regarded gentlemen to my right who I think, as a general proposition, represent every facet of the P3 and the innovative financing community that would be relevant to you today, if not the most relevant persons to give and answer the questions that you may have. I have the fairly happy task, reasonably easy task, as it were, to set the table with some definitions, some terms, concepts, and general thoughts. There will be some revisiting of some of those general themes through these gentlemen's presentations, which is intended to convey at the same time their importance and the consensus across this group about these things, but also they'll have an opportunity to use them as a springboard to get into some more in-depth perspective on that from their perspectives and frankly from the perspectives that they know of everyone else who plays in a P3 scenario. I had the opportunity to pass along some slides in advance, and we are looking at slides here. I'm not sure if you have them in front of you. I'll walk you through them, and I assure you, Mr. Coffey, there will be time, at least on my presentation, for you to ask any questions. So the second slide would take you to what is a P3. There's a lot of debate historically about a P3. Some people think that a P3 is any relationship between a public entity and a private entity, but we're talking in a more technical sense here of a public-private partnership really fundamentally grounded in contract. And it's where a public entity, through an enabling statute, ordinance, or otherwise, is empowered to enter into an arrangement with a private sector for participation and financing of a public project. So you take any interaction between government people and then you push it together and say this is a contract, and it's a contract about projects. There are any number of kinds of projects, there are any number of kinds of contracts, but fundamentally, and this would be the NCPPP's view on what a P3 is, that's what I'm going to be orienting you to when we talk about P3s. As it has evolved here in the States, largely from lessons we've learned from our colleagues over in the UK and Australia and otherwise, there is really a honing in on thinking about the delivery of the project less in terms of complying with the specification and more in terms of delivering a performance. In other settings, I'm fond of suggesting the differences between describing exactly the chocolate chip cookie that I'm expecting you to bake and instead saying, I want a cookie that people will buy and eat. And that's the distinction that we're going through here that could be applied philosophically through what project would find itself percolating up for consideration as a P3. So on the next slide, it's intended to show you essentially a spectrum based upon that understanding of what a public-private partnership is conceptually. It is, in a way, in between two extremes. On one extreme is a traditional government procurement. Generally speaking, the government entity hires someone to design this thing right down to, what kind of knobs go on the dresser. That incurs a cost. And then you go to the lowest bidder on a competitive procurement for someone to build this exact thing. On the other side of the spectrum is a privatization, which is taking a public good and effectively selling it to the private sector and removing your responsibility for it. A public-private partnership, as I'm presenting here, and I believe as we're going to be presenting as a group, is neither of those things. It is, in fact, a little bit of, we're going to design enough to know that we want cookies rather than pound cake. And there's going to be an involvement of the private sector, but they're not going to own it. What they're going to own is the delivery of the performance that you are requiring of them. So if there's a political point to make, and it's often confused, public-private partnerships isn't a fancy long word for privatization. It simply is not. Privatization is a completely different legal undertaking for the reasons that I stated. On the next slide, you will notice that these are sectors where P3s, particularly in the States, but generally speaking across the globe, have touched. I've tried to organize this in ways that you can see that it covers public projects, transportation, water, sewer, energy, public facilities. If you were, those are the golf balls in the middle of the fairway. But it's anything that is made into a project that can be benefited by the innovations that are available by the private sector. I have been a part of conversations where they've talked about public-private partnerships to take over parks and the use of facilities within parks to invite more participation in the park. That was new. That's in my little second bullet point underneath, because I haven't seen one yet, but it underscores the point that it is a possible way to do it. Then you would say, of these sectors, there are ones that generate revenue, and then there are ones that either don't generate enough revenue or don't generate revenue. And there are P3 strategies to help deliver those projects in those ways. A revenue-generating project, for example, would be a bridge with a toll on it. You would project finance essentially the aggregate tolls to fund the building of the bridge, but in a P3 context, it would be that the toll revenue would be available to fund the project measured on the performance of people, not necessarily the people going over the bridge. In other words, people would want to go over the bridge, which would generate more toll revenue because of the things that the private sector hypothetically could bring to the bridge. A social asset would be a school or a courthouse. There's precedent for courthouses. You don't pay a fee to walk into a courthouse, but it's a public good. But there are efficiencies to be gained on how it is that a courthouse and a jail system or any of these other public services could be consolidated into one place and avoid costs, transportation from one facility to another, avoid any number of other costs. Those are not revenues. Those are avoided costs that become essentially a revenue source to deliver that project. My next slide is to show you now that we've shown you the polls and we've showed you who can do it, and if I'm going too fast, just throw your hands up in the air. It's okay. You can go in varying degrees of the involvement of and effectively the tapping into the participation of the private sector in the delivery of the public good. Think of it as wading into a zero-depth swimming pool. You can start by abdicating, as it were, a little bit of the design responsibility to the private sector to say, I really want to build a swimming pool. I know that I want it to be wet and it can't be bigger than this. So rather than telling them the dimensions, you say, I want a swimming pool that fits in this space. You have effectively shifted the design responsibility and several of the design risks to the private sector, and they can bring in a builder and you have a design-build project. But when it's done, they throw you the keys, it's yours. As you move down, there are further opportunities to engage the private sector to deliver other functions that are government functions. Who's going to run the swimming pool after you build it? Well, you might have a contract that allows them to build it in such a way to manage anticipated operations and maintenance costs, and that would be your DBOM, your design, build, operate, maintain. I'll pause here before I go too far to say this is the alphabet soup we're going to be dealing with today, and I'm in many ways looking for your permission to say DBFOM, DBOM, design, build. These are the words that this group operates in, but at no point should you feel bad about asking us what we mean again. Now we shift to the right, and probably if you will, a bit of a salinity change in the P3 is the involvement in the delegation of the responsibility to finance the project. There are P3s, strategies, that delegate the responsibility of financing the project to the private party. There are ways that the public sector folks are used to doing it. You raise bonds, you have your appropriations, you have, your 6-year plan about how you're going to schedule things out. That is all relevant, but at the same time, it might be that the money's not available now, or it's not going to be available at the amounts that we need now, and you can turn to the private sector and ask them to come up with a way to finance this. A design build finance is essentially a build it and then pay back over a period of time. Mr. Ayala at the end of the table, he's one of the experts in the country, if not the world, on how to think creatively about financing. And if his presentation lends itself to it, I invite him to spend a few minutes on what he thinks about when he thinks about delegation of financing. The varsity one, as it were, is the DBFOM, which is, I know what I want. I know that we have some source of money. I know that you can think of a better way to deliver it. I need you to think about this on a long-term concession. Design, build, finance, operate, and maintain now takes from building an asset to thinking about an asset for a life cycle. That swimming pool is going to need repairs. It's going to need to be recaulked. It's going to need to recognize that after 3 to 5 years, your lifeguards are going to go off to college and you're going to need to hire new lifeguards. You can take that and hand it to a private sector concessionaire and say, think about how to do this for 30 to 50 years. Come back to me. We work out what those costs are. They program their expenses. We work out a way to pay them for that over the period of time. And you have now delivered a performance-based project with a lifespan with someone else accountable to deliver it because their money's on the line and their repayments are on the line, which is where I'm going to open up by saying, here's the eye chart of all of the ones that you're going to get in your package today. I've seen my colleagues' presentations. They're far more aesthetically pleasing, but I'm afraid that's all I could do was to get everything I wanted to tell you guys about DBFOMs into 3 slides. So bear with me. This shows you that there's a public agency owner looking to one private partner concessionaire, and everything flows through the private party concessionaire. Colloquially, you might say there's one neck to choke. In my military background, I would say, I know who the commander of the deal is, and I'm going to go to them. And I'm going to say, the trash hasn't been taken out. Why is the roof falling in? How come there's only 2 people manning this thing? You don't have to seek people out going like this. You get to find one person and say, this is what our deal was. You're not delivering. Or this is what our deal was and you are delivering. Good job. So if you'll notice that, that's the key value, in my opinion, that you get from going on to a P3 is the one single point of contact to do this. Okay. Now, when you go to a longer-term P3 arrangement where all of this life cycle consideration, financing obligations are taken into account, you have to rethink what a good project looks like. So when you think about how long to make this concession, you're looking at life cycles, you're having conversations with these bidding concessionaires, and you're thinking rapidly in your brain, this isn't about the lowest bid necessarily. This is about what delivers the best value to us as a public sector entity. Any number of ways to illustrate this, but imagine if somebody said, I want the swimming pool to last for 30 years, you're probably going to spend a little more for concrete because the concrete needs to be able to last for a span of time where when it breaks down, I'm replacing it fewer times, so in the aggregate, there's less cost. But in the short run, there's more expensive concrete. Now add that up for absolutely every single aspect of how this project comes together, and you find yourself in a partnership discussion. So I have as the notion best value, but there's a lot packed into best value, and I think that the hallmark of that best value is you're thinking about this as partners with your private sector partners. So your private sector partners are bringing their ideas. There's mechanisms in the procurement process to do that. But more importantly, you're not speaking behind a veiled wall, all looking at the bottom line. You're thinking about what this thing is supposed to do and how long we can do it where it makes the most sense for our taxpayers. If I can get to the next slide, sir. So this is the second eye-level eye chart, and in case you didn't hear me the first time, I'm apologizing at the top. This is essentially the rough sketch of how you get to a design, build, finance, operate, and maintain. This is mostly so after all of this flood of information you get from you folks when you go back to your office and you're trying to recount what it is that we talked about today, come to this slide and say, here's all of the things that everybody talked about how you get from the concept of a P3 to a P3. The only thing that I will talk about is the drivers here are our ability to deliver this project, the public's ability to drive the project with an identified revenue stream to solve this project financing that's over a longer span of time than you're used to do. And it is about an efficient allocation of risk between the public sector and the private sector to deliver the best value. Now, I'm a lawyer. That sounds like what a lawyer would say. Proper risk allocation between the public and the private sector to deliver best value. Doesn't sound like there's a lot of content in there, and that's where coming attractions, you're going to get some from these gentlemen to my right, and I'm actually going to pop in on a few things myself. There are risks in a 2-year project. There are risks in a traditional design, bid, build, procurement, and then there are risks in a 50-year concession procurement that aren't in either of those first two. Just as an example, what happens if the law changes? That's not something that you think about when you're thinking on a 2-year horizon. What happens if the insurance markets go sideways? What do we do about the up and down on the prices of insurance? There's a lot of risks to consider, and in the consideration up front, you find an efficiency that makes the project viable. So, if there's a highlighter in your hand, the bottom of the screen is what I would want you to do. Think about revenue stream, risk appetite, and then all of the rest falls into place about who's going to participate in the P3 discussion. So how do you participate? And that's the next slide, John. Oh, sorry, I'm sorry, the next slide, my bust. Okay, how do you get started? Well, if you're sold even a little bit on this being something worthwhile, you have to put a framework in place to think about how to engage the private sector, how to figure out if you have projects that lend themselves to P3 consideration, and whether or not those projects are viable as P3s. So my firm, as was alluded to by Mr. Coffey, as a general proposition represents public sector entities who are trying to figure this out. That's what we do. I hope that nobody's tried to shoot me yet, so I'm thinking we're doing okay in the market. So you have to figure out how to walk before you can run into P3s. There are matured, there are maturing, and there are novice public sector entities here in the United States thinking about how to solve infrastructure problems that are of a large scale to engage private sector thoughts and, frankly, to engage private sector financing innovation. All of them that succeeded did this. And it starts by thinking about what are we going to allow ourselves as a government, stewards of the government's, the people's money, stewards of the budgeting process, and stewards of how it is that we're going to rack and stack our projects. How are we going to put those P3 procedures into place? It starts with a law. It starts with a law that I'm sure everyone at this table has very good developed thoughts on what works and what does not work. And I'm happy, of course, to share with you at any time some of my more particular thoughts. But I can tell you that the enabling legislation should reflect the market. If you have the right law, then you will attract the people who know how to do P3s and large-scale deals and solve complicated financing challenges because they know that you're mindful of how the market has responded to that. The second point I will make is that it's transparent. There is no behind the secret door, I know this guy, we all mean this by this word kind of deal. It is, this is what these words mean in the market. People understand how the process works. They know that you're going to follow the process because the law is crystal clear about how it goes about doing it. The third one is that there is reference in your enabling statute to processes, procedures, and implementing regulations that have worked. There's any number of examples of that that are in the market. Any number of our states here in the Union that have stumbled, tripped, fixed, and done better. And then you, hypothetically, can benefit from those lessons learned right out of the gates. And I can tell you that all of your P3 market participants are going to be watching for those things so that they don't have to rehearse with you why it didn't work in state X. Okay, the next step, I'm going to go back one more. I just want to make a couple more points on this if I could. Is that when you get to the point where we're talking about P3s in Rhode Island, It can't be an abstract thing where a bunch of folks in suits and ties, is there ability? Yeah. A bunch of suits and ties were talking about best value and risk allocation and efficiency. There has to be someone who's willing to stand up and say, here's how it works, come ask me questions. Every successful P3 program in the country, for that matter in the world, has someone who's championed it to get it moving. And I think that you may hear that theme a couple times here, that it's more than just the legislation, it's someone fending off people who don't understand the P3. I'm going to pause here to say, a P3 is a tool in the toolbox. One more metaphor for you. It isn't the answer for everything. And indeed, there are any number of projects that should not be done as public-private partnerships. Just shouldn't be. If you have set up a legislation that vets those out and implementing regulations with a champion who knows how to call balls and strikes, you're going to get to a point where it makes sense. But then your next challenge is explaining to people why it's not like what they're used to seeing. You need someone to reach out and touch in those situations. I'm a lawyer advisor. I can load a lot of guns for those discussions, but there needs to be someone's guns to load. I think the most successful P3 programs in the country have an internal champion. The third point that I will hit on this right here is, starting from the third bullet point down, is how do you start after you have a law that lets you go, someone waving the flag, frankly, advisors on board that can tell you how to avoid the pitfalls. How do you get from what are we doing to I have a pipeline of projects that are intelligent, that are going to be managed, that are responsive to the market? It starts with regulations, which Law School 101, that's just another version of a good law. Same lessons apply. Then it becomes a program. Then it becomes trusted advisors who know what they're talking about. And then it becomes building a project pipeline. A pipeline can be a pipeline of one. It can be. So you don't need to think that if you walk down the primrose path of P3s, you need to have 23 things to get people's attention. But I can tell you right now, developing a program for a project is going to make people wary. There's a relationship, there's a partnership responsibility, there's a partnership commitment that you're going to get by engaging the outside. And I leave you at that. So now I'm going to give you a couple high points. I think I'm doing a little bit okay. I got 5 minutes left. I can do this. Most of what I have to say here are the pencil sketch, high-level bullet points, Roman numerals, and an outline of what you're supposed to do. We can go to the next slide, John. How do you identify a P3 program? You start with a lot of navel-gazing. You do what you're doing here today, which is thinking about this delivery process, and then the things are working in the back of your head. John said performance-based. John said scale to engage with the market. Okay, well, what do we got here in Rhode Island? What are we trying to do here? That was the only thing that I learned in graduate school that I remember. I will just tell you. It was my professor saying to me, what are we trying to do here? That is actually the most fundamental step when you walk down this road is, what are our objectives? Do we have projects that are getting out of control in costs? Do we have an unmet need but not necessarily a problem with revenue? Do we really need this project now and we just don't have the revenue now but we'll have the revenue later? These are all drivers to get you from objectives through a thinking of the project into which of those spectrum that we talked about in a P3 context makes the most sense. It is not a paint by numbers. You're going to need some folks to help walk you through that. But I can't tell you what your objectives are. I can ask you a lot of questions till you determine what your objectives are, and then I can say, oh, based on those objectives, we need to be thinking about these things, and we don't need to be thinking about these things. So the next step, if I may, hypothetically, we've gone through this, we've come with a fantastic idea, we have a bullpen of projects that we're excited about. Now, how do you value capture what the P3 delivers? Risk shifting is the purpose of a P3. Risk shifting. Back to my cookie example. If nobody buys the chocolate chip cookie that's 3 inches in diameter with 63 chips in it, that's your problem. But if you say, I want you to make cookies that people buy, and then people don't buy them, that's the private sector's problem, right? That is a shifting of risk. Sometimes when you shift a risk, and my ears are going to be burning, I'm thinking when I'm looking at a lot of red faces over here, sometimes when you shift a risk, the private sector will be happy to take it, and they are going to price it. And then all of the value that you're seeking to capture in a public-private partnership goes away on this principle that you're doing a great job of shifting risk to the private sector. The minute in your brain a little gotcha tone starts floating around, you're dead. Okay? There are things that you're going to retain. But then there are things that you're going to shift to a private sector partner who's willing to do it because they're going to be in a great position to manage that risk. And if they're in an ability to manage that risk in a situation where they're in a competition with other people trying to get that project or to establish that partnership relationship, you're going to get value for money. Lots of buzzwords, that's it. Next slide, if I may. This is only to say, philosophically, when you get into those discussions, this is, in my experience, what you got to go from the first 2 bullet points down to the 4th bullet point. Everybody's used to design, bid, build. Everybody's used to, here are the people that we engage. Everybody's used to their standard terms and conditions. But when you think of things afresh, you step away and realize there are some risks that properly sit with us. And then there are risks that we've historically taken that maybe we can shift to someone else. I will be corrected by the gentleman at this table. The private sector wants to know that they're going to get paid, that they're going to be able to quantify their risks, and that you're going to be playing by the rules. Then you get into a P3 procurement, and that's where the partnership is built. Risks are priceable, payment streams reliable. It's not necessarily certain. We all understand how the appropriations process works. Partnership. If we get to that, you're in the vicinity of getting to close on a deal. And it's actually a wonderful thing when you can see it. All right. I'm actually going to, I think I have overstepped my time, Mr. Coffey, so I will say there is 2 slides from here. There's a thing that says things that I'm not addressing here. And the reason that I'm not addressing them is because these folks are in a really great position to talk about these things. What are they thinking about with financing? What is the role of the federal government sometimes in our procurements that we would want to put forth as the public sector? What are some P3 agreement provisions that you didn't know you need to be thinking about? And probably the most important one, at least from my perspective, is why you should care about the last litany of P3s that have made its way onto the market and been financed, and how those risk allocations were made. Why you should care. I spent a lot of time editorially explaining that point, and you have an opportunity to hear it before you even undertake on that. So without further ado, I will pass it along. I believe Chris is next.
John.
I'm sorry, John next. But thank you for your time, and I'm going to be sitting up here if that's helpful to you for further discussions.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much. Before we get on to the next speaker, is there any burning questions by any members of our commission at this point? Again, we'll have another opportunity at the end to get into a more full-ranging conversation and discussion with all the participants here today, but I leave it to you if you have anything that you really want to address right now. No? Okay, good.
Perfect then.
Good time. You overwhelmed us.